The message arrived on a Tuesday. It came through the standard diplomatic channel, encrypted with the golden seal of the Galactic Council, and it landed on the desk of Secretary General Amara Os at exactly 6:14 in the morning. She was on her second cup of coffee. She read it once, slowly. Then she set her cup down, read it again, and sat back in her chair for a long time without saying anything. Outside her window, the city of New Geneva was waking up. Lights were turning on in apartment buildings. Trams were starting their morning routes. Children were being walked to school. The world looked the same as it always did, quiet, normal, unaware. Inside her office, everything had just changed. The message was not long. The Galactic Council did not waste words. It said simply that the United Earth Directorate was required to send its senior diplomatic representative to the Council's main station, orbiting the gas giant Karath 9, within 30 days. The subject of the meeting was listed as Review of Terran Military Capabilities and the Matter of Galactic Security. At the bottom, in the formal language that the Council used when it wanted to sound polite while doing something hostile, it said that Earth's cooperation was expected and encouraged. Amara had been Secretary General for 6 years. She had dealt with the Council before trade disputes, border questions, the long and boring business of being a junior member of a very old organization. But she had never received something like this. She called her chief advisor, a thin man named Paul, before 7 in the morning. He arrived with his own coffee and read the message standing up. When he finished, he looked at her with wide eyes. "They want to review our weapons," he said. "They want to take them," she said. Paul sat down. The Galactic Council was not a young institution. It had existed for over 4,000 years, built slowly by species that had found each other among the stars and decided, after much war and suffering, that talking was better than fighting. There were 31 member species. Most of them were old, some extraordinarily so. The Velthari, who led the Council's inner circle, had been traveling between stars before humans had learned to write. Humanity had joined 40 years ago. They were the youngest member by a wide margin. When Earth had first made contact with Council scouts, the reaction across the galaxy had been something between curiosity and alarm. Humans were small, short-lived, and came from a single, unremarkable planet. They had no natural advantages in space, no built-in ability to survive vacuum, no instinctive understanding of stellar navigation, nothing that made them obviously special. What they had instead was a history. And that history made the older species deeply uncomfortable. In 40 years of Council membership, humans had been involved in 3 armed conflicts along contested border zones. In each case, they had not started the fight. In each case, they had finished it. They had, in those 40 years, independently developed 11 weapons systems that no other species had ever thought to build. Not because other species were less intelligent, many were far more so, but because the other species had simply never thought in those directions. War, for most Council members, was an unfortunate accident of history, something that happened long ago and was now managed carefully through diplomacy. For humans, it was a living memory. Every generation carried it. This, more than anything else, was what frightened the Council. The formal hearing chamber on Karath 9 station was enormous. It had been built to impress, and it succeeded. The ceiling was so high that the upper portions disappeared into a soft, engineered mist. The seats of the 31-member delegations curved around a central floor in a wide arc, each section designed to accommodate the specific physical needs of each species. Different atmospheres piped to different sections, different lighting, different gravity plates. It was, in its way, a marvel of inclusion. Amara walked in wearing a plain dark suit. She had one aide beside her, just one, a young man named Kale who carried a single folder of documents. She had deliberately left the larger delegation behind. She wanted to look small. She wanted them to underestimate her. The chamber went quiet when she entered. She could feel the weight of thousands of years of alien history pressing down from those seats. She walked to the central floor, stood at the human delegation's position, and waited. The lead arbiter of the council was Suveth, a Velthari elder. The Velthari were tall, pale-skinned, with long fingers and eyes that reflected light in a way that made them look permanently calm, permanently cold. Suveth was old even by Velthari standards. He had been on the council for over 200 years. He spoke slowly and precisely, in the way that very powerful beings speak when they want you to understand that every word was chosen deliberately. He welcomed Amara. He thanked Earth for attending. He spoke for several minutes about the importance of galactic stability, the shared responsibility of all council members, and the necessity of trust between species. Then he presented the Disarmament Accord. It was a long document. Kale's copy ran to 47 pages. The short version was this: Earth was required to decommission its entire military fleet within 3 years. The Terran Defense Corps, the ground-based military force, was to be disbanded. Earth's weapons research programs were to be placed under the direct oversight of a council security body. Human ships would still be allowed to travel, trade, and explore, but they would carry no weapons beyond what the council defined as defensive minimums, a category so narrow it was almost meaningless. In exchange, the council would provide Earth with a security guarantee, a promise that other council members would protect Earth if it was threatened. Amara read every page. The chamber was silent while she did. She read slowly, carefully, without expression. Some of the alien delegates watched her with what might have been satisfaction. Others watched with something harder to read. When she finished, she set the document down on the table in front of her. She looked up at Suveth. "May I ask what evidence has brought the council to this position?" she said. Suveth had prepared for this. He listed the 3 border conflicts. He listed the 11 weapons systems. He described, in careful and diplomatic language, the concern that a species so militarily oriented and so historically conditioned toward conflict posed a risk to the stability of the wider galactic community. He said that this was not a punishment. It was a precaution. He said it gently. He said it as if he was doing her a favor. Amara listened to all of it without interrupting. When he was done, there was a pause. Then she said, "We'll need 72 hours. A small sound moved through the chamber. Not quite surprise, not quite relief, something in between. Suveth looked at her with those cold, reflective eyes and said that 72 hours was acceptable. The council would reconvene after that period to receive Earth's formal response. He had expected Amara could see something more. A protest, perhaps, an argument, anger. The body language of the alien delegates around the chamber suggested that most of them had also expected something more. A few of them leaned slightly forward in their seats, as though waiting for the real response to come. But Amara simply nodded, picked up the document, handed it to Kale, and walked back the way she had come. Kale waited until they were in the corridor outside, well away from the chamber doors, before he spoke. "Secretary General," he said quietly, "are we going to accept it?" "No," she said. "Then what are we doing for 72 hours? She didn't answer right away. They walked the length of the corridor, past tall windows that looked out into space, the gas giant Kareth 9 filling half the view, its orange and brown bands moving slowly in the light of a distant sun. It was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are. "We're going to teach them something," she said finally. Kale looked uncertain. Teach them what? She looked out at the planet for a moment. Then she turned and kept walking. "Who we are," she said, "and how we got here." Back on Earth, the message went out within the hour. It reached Admiral Dren Vasquez aboard the TDS Carthage, currently stationed near the outer belt. It reached Dr. Lena Maury at the University of Cape Town, where she was teaching a morning class on precontact human history. It reached a dozen other people in a dozen other places: soldiers, historians, engineers, and one very old retired general who had fought in the last of the border skirmishes and still walked with a limp from it. The message was simple. It asked them to help build something, not a weapon, not a threat. A record. A complete, honest, unfiltered record of what humanity was, where it came from, what it had done, and more importantly, why. The 72 hours began. In the council chamber, the delegates talked among themselves. Some were satisfied, some were uneasy. A few had the quiet look of people who had just set a trap and were now beginning to wonder, for the first time, whether they had thought it all the way through. Suveth sat in his chair and waited. He was not worried. He had dealt with young species before. They always made noise first, then they accepted reality. He did not yet know that humans had a different relationship with reality than any species he had ever encountered. He would learn. Dr. Lena Mori had been teaching history for 23 years, and in all that time, she had never been asked to do anything like this. She stood in her office at the University of Cape Town, surrounded by books and data drives and stacked paper folders that most of her colleagues found amusing in an age of digital everything. She liked paper. She liked the way it felt. She liked that it could not be edited quietly in the middle of the night by someone with access and a reason. The message from Secretary General Osai had arrived during her morning lecture. She had excused herself, read it twice in the hallway, and then gone back into the classroom and told her students that class was canceled for the rest of the week. When they asked why, she told them something important had come up. That was, she thought, probably the most enormous understatement of her career. The message asked her to compile a full historical record of human warfare, not a summary, not a diplomatic overview softened for alien audiences, the real thing, everything, from the earliest recorded conflicts to the border skirmishes of the last decade, the reasons behind each war, the weapons used, the casualties suffered, the things that were lost and the things that were protected. The Secretary General wanted it complete, honest, and ready for transmission to the Galactic Council within 60 hours. Lena had looked at the timeline and laughed out loud, not because it was funny, because it was insane. Then she had sat down and started working. Admiral Dren Vasquez received his copy of the message while standing on the bridge of the TDS Carthage, watching a routine patrol report scroll across his screen. He was a broad man, heavy through the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that had spent too many years under artificial ship lighting. He had been in the Terran Defense Corps for 31 years. He had seen 2 of the 3 border conflicts up close. He still had a small scar on his left hand from the second one, a burn from a control panel that had shorted out during an attack run. He read the message twice, then called his senior staff to the briefing room. "The Council wants to take our weapons," he told them plainly. There was no point in softening it. His crew were not children. The Secretary General has asked for 72 hours to prepare a response. Part of that response involves us. He looked around the table, 8 officers, different ages, different backgrounds, all of them watching him with the steady attention that good military people develop over years of being in situations where paying attention is the difference between living and not. "We're not preparing for a fight," he said. "We're preparing a document, a record of what we are and why we are this way. Dr. Mori at Cape Town is leading the historical side. We're going to provide the operational context, what it actually looks like, what it costs, what it means to be the people who stand between everyone else and the thing trying to hurt them." One of his younger officers, a lieutenant named Sasha, raised her hand slightly. "Sir, do you think it'll work, showing them this?" Vasquez thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think. "I don't know," he said, "but if it doesn't, nothing else will either, so we do the work." In the archive vaults beneath the United Earth Directorate's main building in New Geneva, Lena Mori worked through the night. She had 3 assistants with her, young historians who had dropped everything to come when she called. They pulled files, sorted data, cross-referenced dates and casualty reports and political records going back thousands of years. The history of human warfare was not a small subject. It was, in many ways, the central subject of all human history. Every century had its conflicts. Every generation had its wars. Some were enormous, the kind that reshaped borders and destroyed cities and left scars in the earth that were still visible from orbit. Some were small, quiet, brutal things that never made the grand history books, but were no less real to the people who lived through them. Lena did not flinch from any of it. She had spent her career looking at the worst of what humans had done to each other, and she had made a choice a long time ago not to look away. Looking away was comfortable. It was also dishonest, and dishonesty in her profession was the one thing she could not forgive. She organized the record not by date but by reason. Every conflict categorized by what drove it: resources, territory, belief, fear, revenge, protection. The categories were not always clean. Most wars had more than one cause, layered over each other like sediment. But the patterns emerged as they always did when you looked at enough data. And the pattern that emerged most clearly, across all of human history, across every century and every culture, was this: humans almost never fought for the joy of it. They fought because they were afraid. They fought because something they loved was threatened. They fought because they had already tried everything else, or because someone else had not given them the chance. This was not an excuse. Lena was not interested in excuses. The record showed terrible things: massacres, atrocities, destruction on a scale that was difficult to look at directly. Humans had done monstrous things to each other. The record would not hide that. But it would also show the other side. The soldiers who had died holding a position so that civilians could escape. The medics who had worked in the open, in the middle of firefights, because the wounded needed them and they had taken an oath. The ordinary people who had picked up weapons they didn't want to use and gone into the dark because no one else was going to go. On the TDS Carthage, Admiral Vasquez was recording his own contribution. He sat in a small room off the main corridor, alone, with a recording device and a cup of cold coffee he kept forgetting to drink. He had been asked to speak about the operational reality of Terran military service, what it actually was, what it asked of the people who did it. He found it harder than he expected. Not because he didn't know what to say. He knew exactly what to say. He had lived it. The difficulty was that some of it lived very close to the surface, even now, even after 3 decades. He talked about the second border conflict, about a small station near the edge of Terran space that had been caught between 2 aggressive fleets, neither of them human. The station had housed about 400 civilians, miners, and their families mostly. When the fighting started, the evacuation ships were not fast enough. The Carthage, then under a different captain, had put itself between the station and the attacking fleet, and held that position for 11 hours while the civilians loaded. 212 crew members died in those 11 hours. The station was saved. Vasquez paused in his recording and looked at the wall for a moment. "I want to be clear about something," he said quietly to the recording device. "The people who made that choice, who stayed in that position knowing what it was going to cost, they were not looking for glory. They were not thinking about history. They were thinking about those 400 people on the station who were scared and needed more time." He picked up his cold coffee, looked at it, set it back down. "That's what we are. That's what we have always been. Not a weapon, not a threat, a wall. We put ourselves between the dangerous thing and the people who can't protect themselves. We have been doing it for as long as we have existed as a species. We learned it on a planet that was trying to kill us before we could even name the things that were trying to kill us." He stopped the recording, sat quietly for a moment, then he started it again. "The Council is afraid of us," he said. "I understand that. I would be afraid of us too if I didn't know the context. But the context is everything. A hammer looks like a weapon until you understand that the person holding it is trying to build a shelter before the storm hits. We are not the storm. We have never been the storm. We are the people who stand outside in it, so others don't have to." Back in the archive vault, Lena and her team finished the record at 4 in the morning, with 8 hours to spare. She sat back in her chair and looked at what they had built. It filled several data drives. It covered thousands of years. It was, she thought, the most honest thing she had ever produced. It did not try to make humans look good. It did not try to make them look bad. It simply told the truth about what they were and where they came from. One of her young assistants, a woman named Yara, came and stood beside her, looking at the finished files. "Do you think they'll understand it?" Yara asked. Lena thought about the alien delegates she had seen in footage from past council sessions. The old, cold Velthari, the careful, cautious Dravaki, species that had evolved in calmer places, perhaps, or had simply been lucky enough to grow up without quite so much trying to eat them. "Some of them will," she said. "Some of them won't want to, and some of them," she paused. "Some of them will understand it better than they expected to, and that will be the hardest thing of all for them to admit." She packaged the record and sent it to Kale on the Karath 9 station, who would pass it to the Secretary General. Then she leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and thought about all those people from all those centuries, the frightened and the brave and the stubborn and the desperate, who had somehow, generation after generation, kept getting up. She thought that was, in the end, what humans were. Not warriors. Not conquerors. Just people who kept getting up. On the council station, in a small side office that had been assigned to the junior Velthari staff, a young aide named Vane sat at her desk late at night. She had received a copy of the human historical files through a back channel. One of the human delegation's aides had sent it informally, without explanation. She had not meant to read all of it. She read all of it. She sat for a long time afterward, very still, in the way that her species went still when something had moved them and they were not sure what to do about it. She had studied humans as part of her diplomatic training. She had read the standard council assessments: dangerous, unpredictable, overaggressive, a species that had not yet learned the restraint that came with age. The record she had just read told a different story. Not a comfortable story, not a clean one, but a true one, she thought. A true one about creatures who had been hurt again and again across thousands of years and had never, not once, decided that the answer was to stop caring about each other. She did not have a word in her language for what she felt. Later, when she tried to explain it to another aide, the closest she could come was ashamed. Not of humanity. Of the Accord. The 72 hours ended on a Thursday morning, station time. The grand chamber of the Galactic Council filled slowly, the way it always did before an important session, delegates arriving in clusters, aides carrying documents, the soft hiss and hum of different atmospheric systems adjusting to different needs. The enormous room settled into its usual organized quiet, 31 delegations in their assigned positions, the curved arc of seats looking down at the wide central floor where the real business was conducted. Suveth arrived last, as was his custom. He moved to the arbiter's position at the head of the chamber with the unhurried confidence of someone who had presided over 10,000 sessions and expected this one to go much like the others. He had spent the past 3 days in consultation with several senior council members. The mood among them was cautiously optimistic. The human delegate had asked for time, not argument. That suggested to most of them that Earth understood its position. What none of them had noticed, because it had happened quietly and through channels that were technically public but practically unmonitored, was that the session had been broadcast. Not just to Earth, to every inhabited world in the known galaxy. Every species with access to the Council's open communications network, which was most of them, could watch the session live. The transmission had gone out 6 hours earlier, announced simply as a matter of significant galactic interest. By the time the chamber began to fill, billions of beings across hundreds of worlds were watching their screens. Secretary General Amara Os walked in and the chamber went quiet. She was not alone this time. Behind her came the full Terran diplomatic corps, 12 people, dressed in plain, dark clothes, carrying nothing dramatic. No weapons, no displays of technology, no symbols of military power. Just 12 humans walking calmly into a room where 31 alien civilizations were waiting. Amara took her position on the central floor. She placed a single document on the table in front of her. Then she looked up at Suveth. "The United Earth Directorate has considered the disarmament accord," she said. Her voice was clear and even. "We have an answer." Suveth nodded. "The council is ready to receive it." Amara did not reach for her document. "Not yet." "Before I give our formal response," she said, "I'd like to ask the council's permission to share something. A record. It concerns the history of humanity, where we come from, what we have done, and why. I believe it is relevant to this discussion. It will take about 20 minutes. There was a brief pause. Suveth glanced at two of the senior delegates beside him. They exchanged looks in the way that old colleagues do when they have already discussed a thing and come to an agreement. He nodded. "The council permits it," he said. Amara nodded to Kale, standing at the edge of the floor. The lights in the chamber shifted slightly as the transmission began, projected not just into the room but outward, into the broadcast, so that every being watching on every world could see and hear the same thing. For 20 minutes, the chamber was silent. What they saw was not a presentation. It was not polished or arranged for comfort. Dr. Mori had been very deliberate about that. What the chamber saw was the truth of human history, assembled plainly and without decoration. Wars and their causes, casualty numbers that were almost impossible to absorb, conflicts that had lasted decades, fought over land or water or belief or simple, desperate fear, terrible things that humans had done to each other. And alongside those, the other things, the medics in the open ground, the soldiers who had held positions they knew they would not survive so that others could escape. The civilians who had rebuilt cities with their bare hands after those cities had been destroyed. The way that humans, after every catastrophe, had looked at each other and somehow, decided to try again. When it ended, the chamber stayed quiet for a long moment. Then Amara spoke. "We are not a comfortable species," she said. "We know that. We have never pretended otherwise. Our history is not clean, and we will not insult this chamber by suggesting it is. We have done terrible things. We carry that." She paused. "But I want the council to understand something about that history. Every weapon in it, every strategy, every doctrine, every piece of military technology we have ever developed came from loss. We did not build weapons because we enjoyed building them. We built them because something we loved was taken from us, or threatened, or we could see the threat coming and we refused to be helpless when it arrived." She let that sit in the air for a moment. "The Council's accord asks Earth to disarm, to trust that the security guarantee offered by this body will protect our people, with respect." And here her voice stayed perfectly level, perfectly calm. "We have been alive long enough to know what happens to people who cannot protect themselves when the protection they were promised does not arrive." She picked up her own document from the table. It was thin, much thinner than the accord. "This is Earth's response. We call it the Osai Doctrine for reasons that will become clear." She read it aloud. "Earth will disarm completely the moment every species in this chamber disarms completely. We will decommission every warship the hour you decommission yours. We will stand down every soldier when you stand down yours. We ask for nothing more than we are prepared to give, but we will not give it unilaterally. We will not apologize for surviving, and we will not trust our people's safety to a promise." She set the document down. The chamber was very quiet. Several delegates were looking at each other. A few were looking at Suveth. The Velthari elder's face, as always, was difficult to read, those pale, reflective eyes giving away nothing. Then Amara said, "I'd like to play one more thing. It's short, 3 minutes." She nodded to Kale again. What came out of the speakers was not visual. It was audio only. 3 minutes of raw, unprocessed sound from the Battle of Callisto Station, recorded 20 years ago during the Second Border Conflict. The TDS Callisto had been a smaller vessel than the Carthage, a defense frigate assigned to protect a civilian transfer station near the outer edge of Terran space. When an armed pirate fleet of thousands had moved on the station, the Callisto and its crew of 340 had moved with them. The audio was not dramatic in the way that recordings of battles were often made dramatic in stories. It was not music and heroic voices. It was real. It was communications between crew members, some of them very young, coordinating damage control and evacuation procedures while the ship was being hit. It was the sound of systems failing. It was the sound of people telling each other what to do in voices that were afraid but steady. It was, in one short section, the sound of a young engineer laughing, actually laughing, at something one of her colleagues said in the middle of everything, because humans sometimes laughed when they were terrified, and no one had ever been able to explain why. 310 of the crew of the TDS Callisto died in that engagement. The station held, every civilian evacuated safely. When the audio ended, the chamber was silent for a very long time. No translation was needed. The sounds of human beings choosing to stay, choosing to hold, required no interpreter. Whatever language you spoke, whatever atmosphere you breathed, whatever planet you came from, the sound of people being afraid and doing the thing anyway was something that needed no explanation. Amara did not say anything else. She waited. The silence stretched, and then from one of the far sections of the chamber, from the delegation of the Marin, a small, quiet species that rarely spoke during open sessions, came a sound. A low, rhythmic tapping on the surface of their desk. It was, in Marin culture, the sound of respect given to the dead. One by one, other delegations joined it. Not all of them, but more than Suveth had expected. The tapping filled the chamber, uneven and overlapping, each species expressing the same thing in its own way. Suveth did not tap. He sat very still and looked at Amara Osai with those cold, reflective eyes, and for just a moment, one unguarded moment, something moved behind them. Something that might have been recognition, or something older and harder than that. He recovered quickly. "The Council thanks the Terran delegation for their presentation," he said, in his measured, formal voice. "We will move now to deliberation on the accord." 3 members moved immediately to table the vote. 2 others seconded. The vote to delay was called. It passed narrowly. The accord was not dead, but it had just become much harder to hold together. Amara gathered her document and turned to leave. As she passed the edge of the floor, she paused briefly, barely noticeably, near the section where the junior Velthari staff were seated. The young aide, Vane, sat very still, her hands folded, her pale eyes fixed on the middle distance. Amara did not stop, but as she walked past, she looked at the young aide, and something passed between them, just a look, brief and quiet. That was not a threat and not a comfort, but something close to acknowledgement. "I see you," the look said, "and you see us now, really see us." Outside the chamber, in the corridor, Kale exhaled slowly and looked at the Secretary General. 3 members moved to table it, he said. "That's more than we expected." "Yes," Amara said. "Do you think it'll hold?" She walked toward the docking bay where the Terran shuttle was waiting. The great windows of the corridor showed Karath 9 hanging in the dark below them, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. "For now," she said, "but we're not done. The accord isn't dead. Suveth will push again. He's been doing this for 200 years. He won't stop because of one hard session." "Then what do we do?" She looked out at the planet. "We wait," she said quietly, "and we hope that the galaxy gives us the chance to show them one more time who we really are." She did not know then how soon that chance would come, or what it would cost. Across the galaxy, on 100 worlds, beings who had watched the session live were quiet in their homes and public spaces, thinking about the 3 minutes of audio from a transfer station 20 years ago, and the sound of 310 people who had stayed. Some of them would forget it by morning. Some of them would not forget it for the rest of their lives. 6 weeks after the session in the Grand Chamber, the Galactic Council was quietly falling apart. Not dramatically, not with raised voices or broken agreements or delegations walking out. That was not how old institutions broke. They broke the way old stone broke, slowly, from the inside, along fault lines that had always been there, but had never been stressed quite this hard before. The broadcast of the session had done things that Suveth had not anticipated. On dozens of worlds, public conversations had shifted. Species that had never thought much about humanity were thinking about them now. Some of those conversations were hostile. Yes, the humans are dangerous, the Accord was correct, they should be controlled. But many of them were something else, complicated, questioning. The kind of conversations that are hard to manage once they have started. 3 council members who had previously supported the Accord were now publicly reviewing their position. 2 others had quietly stopped returning Suveth's communications. The Vilthari elder was not a man who panicked. He had been in politics long enough to know that every situation had a pressure point, and that patience, applied correctly, could move almost anything. He began building a coalition with the Dravaki hegemony, the most militarized non-human power in the council, a species that had never liked humanity much and had their own reasons for wanting Earth's military capacity reduced. With Dravaki support, Suveth calculated, a second vote on the Accord could still succeed. He was patient, he was careful, he believed, completely in control. Then the Vreth signal appeared. It came from the edge of Velthari space, in a system called Renketh, 3 inhabited planets, mostly agricultural, population of roughly 2 billion Velthari civilians. The signal was old, in the sense that the light from whatever had produced it had been traveling for time, but the source was not old. The source was very much present. The Vreth convergence. Every species in the council knew the name. Most of them knew it the way you know the name of a disaster from history, something that happened, something terrible, something that was over. The Vreth were a swarm mind species, which meant they did not think as individuals but as a collective consciousness distributed across thousands of biological units. A century ago, they had moved through 2 star systems at the outer edge of known space and left nothing behind. Not ruins, not wreckage, nothing. Both systems had been inhabited. After that, they had simply vanished. The council had spent 50 years searching and found nothing. The general consensus, eventually, had been that they were gone, extinct. Something had happened to them out in the dark beyond map space. The signal from Renketh said otherwise. The first Velthari defense fleet to respond was destroyed within 4 hours of arrival. The second fleet was already repositioned, part of Suveth's quiet political maneuvering in preparation for the second Accord vote, moved to a staging area several systems away to signal readiness without technically violating any existing treaties. Getting it back to Renketh would take days. The council convened in emergency session. Every member species was present, and the atmosphere in the chamber was nothing like the careful formality of 6 weeks ago. It was fear. Clean, open fear, moving through the room like weather. Committees were formed. Protocols were cited. 3 different subbodies were appointed to coordinate a response. The Dravaki offered their fleet but attached conditions. They wanted formal command authority over any combined military action, which 4 other species immediately opposed. The Marin proposed a diplomatic contact attempt with the Vreth, which everyone else pointed out had been tried a century ago and had not gone well. Hours passed. Renketh's second planet had gone silent. The Committee on Coordination had not yet reached an agreement on the scope of its mandate. On the TDS Carthage, Admiral Dren Vasquez was watching all of this on the same open channels as everyone else. The Carthage was currently stationed 11 light minutes from Kareth 9, well within range of the Council's communication network. Vasquez had a full crew, a fully operational ship and a fleet, the 7th Terran Expeditionary Fleet, 7 vessels in total, all armed, all ready. He had no orders. He was not technically supposed to act without Council authorization or without direction from the United Earth Directorate. Those were the rules. He understood why the rules existed. He had followed them for 31 years. He watched the Committee on Coordination's 3rd subgroup form to discuss the scope of the 2nd subgroup's mandate, while on the open channel from Renketh, a Velthari civilian broadcast station that had not yet been taken was transmitting a single repeating message. "We are still here. We are still here. We are still here." Vasquez sat in his chair on the bridge of the Carthage for approximately 4 minutes. Then he stood up. "Navigation," he said, Plot a jump to Renketh. His first officer, a woman named Commander Yale Park, turned from her station. Admiral, we don't have authorization. I know. The council hasn't issued. I know. His voice was not angry. It was very quiet and very certain. Plot the jump, Commander. Park held his gaze for one moment. Then she turned back to her station. Jump plotted, she said. Vasquez opened the fleet-wide channel. All 7 ships of the 7th Expeditionary could hear him. This is Admiral Vasquez. We are jumping to Renketh. There are 2 billion civilians in that system and they need help. That's all the authorization I need. That's all the authorization any of us have ever needed. He paused. Jump on my mark. He opened one more channel, the Council's open emergency frequency, which every member species was monitoring. This is Admiral Dren Vasquez of the TDS Carthage, commanding the 7th Terran Expeditionary Fleet. We are moving to Renketh. We are not asking permission. We are not waiting for a committee. There are people there. He closed the channel. Mark, he said. The Carthage jumped. What followed was 11 hours that Vasquez would not speak about in detail for years afterward. The Vreth convergence was everything the historical records had suggested and worse. They did not fight the way other species fought. No formations, no tactics in the conventional sense, just a wave of biological mass that moved and responded and adapted in real time like a single enormous organism. They had already reached the 3rd planet of the Renketh system when the 7th Fleet arrived. The battle was not clean. It was not heroic in any neat, story-shaped way. It was 7 ships against something that did not feel pain and did not understand retreat and did not stop. 2 of the 7 ships were destroyed in the first hour. A 3rd took damage so severe it had to pull back to minimum safe distance. Vasquez moved the Carthage into the gap and held it there, because that was what you did when there was a gap and you had a ship. He took a piece of shrapnel across the jaw in the 4th hour when a secondary console exploded beside him. He did not leave the bridge. In the 7th hour, the Dravaki fleet arrived. They had moved without waiting for the committee's authorization, which no one would acknowledge publicly for several months. In the 9th hour, 2 Marin vessels arrived. Small ships, lightly armed, but their navigators knew the local stellar geography and used it to drive sections of the Vreth mass into positions where the heavier ships could concentrate fire. In the 11th hour, the Vreth convergence withdrew. Not defeated, that was not a word anyone used. They pulled back, the way a wave pulls back from a shore. They were still out there, somewhere in the dark beyond Renketh, but they had pulled back. The system was intact. The 3 planets were intact. The civilian broadcast station on the 1st planet was still transmitting. It had stopped repeating its distress message. It was playing music now, old Velthari music, slow and deep, the kind that was played after funerals, after hard things, when people needed to be reminded that something still continued. On the surface of Renketh's 1st planet, in a field outside the main population center that had been converted into a field hospital, a human medic named Corporal Bree Santos was setting a broken forearm. The patient was a Velthari male, probably middle-aged by their standards. He had been part of a civilian defense group that had tried to hold a perimeter near one of the agricultural processing facilities. Most of his group had not survived. He had a broken arm, several cuts, and a look in his eyes that Bree recognized. The specific, hollow look of someone who had seen things they were still trying to process. He also, she was fairly certain, had been armed with a weapon that would have been turned against human ships if the Accord had gone through and the political situation had escalated. She didn't know that for certain. She didn't ask. She set the bone. She wrapped the arm. She told him he was going to be fine, in the standard Velthari phrase she had learned in basic medical training, which her accent mangled slightly in a way that apparently sounded, to Velthari ears, mildly amusing. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something she didn't fully catch. Her Velthari was limited, but Kale, who was nearby and had better language training, translated it later. He had said, "Why did you come?" And she had said, without thinking about it, in the simple way that people answer questions when they are tired and the answer seems obvious, because you needed help. Suveth arrived at Renketh 4 days after the battle, when it was safe to bring civilian transports in. He walked through the field hospital. He walked through the damaged sections of the first city, where human engineering teams were already working alongside Velthari crews to assess structural damage and begin repairs. He watched a human pilot he didn't know spend 3 hours helping dig through rubble to reach a group of trapped children, working alongside a Velthari rescue worker, the two of them communicating through a translation device strapped to the pilot's wrist. He stood in the field outside the hospital for a long time, alone, looking at his world, his people's world, one of the original Velthari settled planets, older than the Council itself. He looked at the human medics moving between cots. He had spent 200 years studying war. He had read every doctrine, every historical analysis, every philosophical treatise written by every species that had ever committed violence in an organized way. He believed he understood what war was, what it produced in a species, what it did to them over time. He was no longer certain he had understood anything at all. 6 months after the Battle of Renketh, the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council filled once more. It looked the same as it always did. The same high ceiling disappearing into engineered mist, the same curved arc of 31 delegations, the same soft sounds of different atmospheric systems, the same carefully adjusted lighting for 31 different sets of eyes. To look at it, you would not know that anything had changed. But things had changed. You could feel it if you knew where to look. 3 delegations that had been solid supporters of the disarmament accord were now seated with the careful, distant posture of people who had not yet decided what they were going to do. The Dravaki section, which had usually aligned with Suveth's inner circle on sensitive votes, was quiet in a different way than usual, less self-assured, more watchful. The Marin delegation, the small quiet species that had sent 2 lightly armed ships to Renketh without waiting for authorization, sat with a dignity they had not always carried so visibly. The human delegation entered. Amara Osai walked to the central floor. Admiral Vasquez walked beside her, which was unusual, a military officer in the diplomatic chamber, but no one raised an objection. He wore his uniform. He had a thin scar along the left side of his jaw that was still pink. He would carry it for the rest of his life. Suveth arrived last. He moved to the arbiter's position. He looked older than he had 6 months ago, which was unusual for a Velthari. Their aging was slow and even, not responsive to stress in the visible way that human aging was. But something had shifted in how he carried himself. Something had settled differently in those pale, reflective eyes. The session was called to order. Suveth had formally requested this session. He had listed its purpose as Final Deliberation and Vote, Disarmament Accord, Terran Military Capabilities Review. The phrasing was bureaucratic and neutral. It gave nothing away. Amara had spent the past 6 months preparing for this vote. She had done the diplomatic work carefully, conversations with individual delegations, responses to concerns, quiet reassurances where they were needed and honest answers where they were not. She did not know, as she stood on the floor of the chamber, whether she had done enough. The count was close. It had been close for weeks and had not moved much. She was prepared to argue. She was prepared, if it came to it, to propose modifications to the accord that would reduce its scope while preserving Earth's core military capacity. She had a folder of counter-proposals with her. She had rehearsed 3 different versions of her closing statement. She did not end up needing any of it. Suveth called the session to formal order, read the procedural requirements, acknowledged all 31 delegations by name in the traditional way. Then he paused. What happened next was not on the agenda. He spoke, not in the formal, precise cadences of a council arbiter giving a ruling. In a different voice, slower and somehow heavier, like a man carrying something that he had been carrying for a while and had finally decided to set down. I have served on this council for 212 years, he said. I have presided over 407 formal votes. I have been present for 7 major treaty negotiations and 3 species membership processes. I believe I have acted, in all of those situations, in accordance with my best understanding of what was right and what would maintain stability in this community. He paused again. I was wrong about the disarmament accord. The chamber was absolutely still. I was wrong about what it was. I described it internally and publicly as a precaution, a responsible measure to address the genuine concerns of member species about Terran military capacity. That was not entirely false. Those concerns exist. They are real. But the accord itself was not primarily a precaution. It was a disarmament of a species that frightened us. And it was dressed in the language of responsibility, because that language is more comfortable than the honest one. He looked directly at Amara Osai as he said the next part. I studied humans for 40 years before Earth joined this council. I read every available analysis, every contact report, every cultural study. I believed I understood what I was dealing with. A young species, conditioned by a violent history, requiring careful management as they integrated into a more mature galactic community. He stopped. Something moved across his face, something that, on a human face, would have been called grief. I went to Renketh, he said. I walked through what remained of Venkara City. I stood in the field hospital outside the 3rd district, and I watched a human medical officer spend 11 hours treating Velthari patients, one after another with no rest, on a world she had never visited for people who had, until very recently, been subject to a policy she had every reason to resent. He paused. I asked her, through a translator, why she had volunteered for the medical deployment. She told me she was not sure she understood the question. A sound moved through the chamber, not tapping this time, something quieter. She was not sure she understood why helping people who needed help would require a reason. Suveth straightened. He reached forward and picked up the copy of the disarmament accord that had been placed, as procedure required, on the arbiter's desk at the start of every session since it had been introduced. He held it for a moment. Then he set it down on the edge of the desk and pushed it firmly off. It fell to the floor below the arbiter's position with a flat, unremarkable sound. The accord is withdrawn, he said. Entirely. It will not return to this chamber while I am arbiter, and I intend to recommend to the membership that it be formally struck from the record of active proposals. He looked around the chamber. I have studied war for 300 years, he said. I believed I understood it. I did not understand it until I watched a human medic set a broken bone on a man who would have been her enemy under different circumstances, and then tell him he was going to be fine. I ask only that this body learn the same lesson I have learned before it becomes necessary for the humans to teach it again under worse conditions. He sat down. The chamber was quiet for a long time. Then the Marin delegation began their tapping. This time it was not uncertain or gradual. It was immediate and steady, and within moments it had spread across more than half the delegations in the room, overlapping and uneven and completely genuine. Amara Osai stood on the central floor and did not move. Her expression was composed. She had been composed through all of it, the summons, the accord, the session 6 months ago, the months of diplomatic work, all of it. She was composed now. But Vasquez, standing just behind her left shoulder, saw her hands, just her hands held at her sides. He saw them tighten for a moment and then release, just once. He understood. He felt it too. Not triumph, something quieter and deeper and harder to name, the feeling of having been seen clearly, finally, after a very long time of being misunderstood. After the session in the corridor outside the chamber, Amara walked slowly. The diplomatic corps moved around her, already talking quietly about next steps, follow-up communications, the formal documentation that would need to be filed. The business of the world continued, as it always did, even after the large things happened. She paused near the wide window that looked out at Kareth 9. The planet was the same as it always was, enormous, orange-brown, beautiful in its complete indifference to everything happening on the station above it. Vane, the young Vilthari aide, was standing near the window. She had been at every session. She had watched all of it, the first session, the broadcast, the 6 months of political work today. She stood now with her hands folded and her pale eyes on the planet, and she looked, Amara thought, like someone who had started a journey 6 months ago and had only just realized how far they had come. Amara stopped beside her. The young aide looked at her. She started to say something formal, some diplomatic acknowledgement, some appropriate phrase. Amara spoke first, quietly without formality. "We're not a weapon," she said. "We're a warning and a promise, depending on which side you're standing on." Vane looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, slowly, with a gravity that suggested she understood both parts of that sentence and had been thinking about the difference between them for a long time. Amara walked on. Admiral Vasquez returned to the Carthage that evening. The ship was quiet at this hour, most of the crew on rest cycle, the hum of the engines, a low and constant presence under everything. He walked the main corridor from the docking bay to the bridge out of habit, the way he always did when he came back aboard, just to feel the ship around him. He stopped at the wide forward viewport on the bridge. Space was very dark out here, and very full, stars everywhere you looked, more than you could count, each one possibly with something around it, possibly with someone. He thought about the 2 ships they had lost at Renketh. He thought about the names on those ships, the people he had sent into that fight without orders, without authorization, without anything except his own certainty that it was right. He thought about whether he would do it again. He knew the answer. He had always known the answer. That was, perhaps, exactly what the Council had been afraid of. But the Council was beginning to understand, slowly. That fear of the answer was not the same as the answer being wrong. 2 weeks later, a Terran Deep Range explorer vessel called the TDS Meridian was operating at the very edge of map space, far beyond Renketh, beyond the last charted systems, in the long dark where the maps ran out and became guesswork. The Meridian had a crew of 80. Its mission was survey and first contact preparation, the careful, patient work of mapping what was out there and establishing whether anything out there was looking back. At 3:40 ship time, the sensors picked up a signal. Unknown origin, unknown type. It was not in any database. It did not match any known species communication signature. It was not immediately identifiable as hostile. But it was directed, pointed, deliberate, the signature of something that was aware of the Meridian and had chosen to make contact. Captain Yara Obi, the same Yara who had worked with Dr. Mori in the archive vault 6 months ago, who had asked whether the aliens would understand, had come a long way since those nights in the Cape Town basement. She sat in the captain's chair and looked at the signal data on her screen for a moment. Then she squared her shoulders. She thought about the 212 crew of the TDS Callisto who had stayed. She thought about the medic in the field hospital who had not understood why helping people needed a reason. She thought about a secretary general standing in a chamber full of the oldest civilizations in the galaxy, alone except for one aide, and not being afraid. She looked at her navigation officer. "Set a course," she said. Humanity had never been the monster the galaxy feared. It had never been simple enough for that. It was something much harder to categorize, a species that had known every kind of darkness, had made every possible mistake, had hurt each other in ways that were almost too painful to record, and had chosen, generation after generation, to keep going, to keep building, to keep standing between the dangerous thing and the people who needed protecting. Not because they were the strongest. Not because they had the biggest ships or the most advanced weapons. Because they were the ones who, when everything was bad and the outcome was uncertain and the cost was real, when the committee was still forming and the authorization had not arrived, and there was no clear reason that applied to them specifically, they went anyway. The stars did not remember the species that were careful. They remembered the ones that moved toward the signal in the dark. The Galactic Council tried to disarm humanity. The answer shook the stars. And we are not a weapon. We are a warning and a promise, depending on which side you're standing on. Secretary General Amara Osai, Karath 9 Station, 2387.